Okay, hello everybody, and so I want to start a new series on this channel where I help some of you budding composers get into learning how to compose for video game, film, that kind of thing. A little bit of introduction. I know I haven't really introduced myself too much, but yeah. So I'm Raven, and on basically this presentation we're going to be on this guide we're going to be talking about different compositional topics that I think that are hyper important for any beginner composer to get the grasp of in order to be able to start composing for different projects. So in this first episode of this little series on how to compose for beginners, we're going to talk about composition styles. What are they, and what are their workflows like, and hopefully by the end of this you're a little bit more informed on how you can take which style fits you best and how you can best compose in that particular style. So let's move on to this. Let's see here. Yoink. So yeah, a little bit about me. Like I said, I'm Nick, also known as Raven. I'm a video game composer with a specialization in writing orchestral or metal music for RPGs. So that's my background. I'm primarily an orchestral musician. I've been in the orchestra for about 4 years of my life already. Been part of several, school. I've been part of the school orchestra, been part of a kind of a national kind of, not really, I would say more of a citywide citywide string orchestra. Also traveled internationally to join up with other orchestras which have affiliation with the school. So that's my particular background. I also have a very big interest in writing metal stuff and listening to metal and playing electric guitar. That's one of my other kind of instruments that I play. My primary instrument is the viola. Make fun of me all you want. But yeah, so that's where my background is, and that's why I love writing orchestral and metal music for RPGs. So yeah, moving on. So what are compositional styles? So I like to define compositional style as the way someone chooses to compose, and let's get some definitions out of the way here. When I talk about styles, I don't quite mean like writing for an RPG or writing for action, that kind of thing. It's not really that. It's more of how do you compose? What software, what tools do you use to compose? And that's what I really want to kind of dive in on and to explore with you guys in order for you guys to kind of see this potential of different styles. Because I think the more we get to know these styles, the better informed you can be to pick a style and to stick with it for a compositional journey. Every person is different. Don't feel like you have to be, following a particular style. There's no gatekeeping here. If you want to mix and match styles, perfectly fine also. Although I'm pretty sure you'll fall into one of these categories. So yeah, so we're going to explore these various styles through the perspective of popular composers. So, what are the 3 styles that I personally think exist in composition? Well, the 3 styles that I personally, again, this is all coming from personal experience. Although I have about 2 years of formal training, it didn't really amount to too much because I was really bad at theory anyways. And a lot of my theory knowledge comes from studying after my formal training, like self-study and self-learning. So take everything with, of course, a pinch of salt. Don't think that this is the law or anything. This is simply the way I like to think about it and the way I personally kind of classify all these styles. And like I said, some of you might think that there are no styles. That's perfectly fine. I want to just share my perspective, and hopefully this helps some of you figure out how you would like to compose. So the 3 styles that I personally identify in composition is, one is called pen and paper. or pure notation. This is the composer that uses just what's in the title, pen and a paper. They take the sheet music, they take the manuscript paper, and they just start writing. They start just writing on a pen and paper the notes. Maybe they play on a piano, they write the notes, play on a piano, write the notes. Or nowadays, for composers who love pen and paper, there's notation software, right? There's Sibelius, there's Dorico, there's MuseScore, right? So I think more modern pen and paper composers don't really use pen and paper too much. I mean, they still are definitely composers that love using pen and paper, and if that's the way you function, that's fine. But most composers, I think nowadays, would prefer to use something like Dorico or MuseScore or Sibelius in order just to be quicker with their compositions and to get their ideas out faster and to have this kind of live feedback. Because when you put notes in notation software, usually you can listen to it and you can like play it through, and so you get this live feedback as you're composing. Second type of composers is called I like to call the DAW sketch notated after composers. So what does this mean? These type of composers typically would start in a DAW, a digital audio workstation. Let's get that terminology as well. DAW stands for digital audio workstation, and it simply just means something. It's like a piece of software that you can use to write music in. However, instead, it's not purely notation software. DAW typically, examples of DAW include FL Studio, Logic Pro X, Cubase, Ableton, Pro Tools, I believe is also a DAW, many more, Reaper, right? There's a lot more probably out there that I'm not super familiar with, but those seem to be the popular ones. They would typically sketch it out in a DAW, so they will use the DAW in order to write this orchestral sketch with the virtual instruments provided with the DAW, or through purchasing these virtual instruments afterwards. And then what they'll do is they'll take this DAW sketch and then they will notate it afterwards. They will literally go into MuseScore and write out the part scores themselves, and they will orchestrate it in MuseScore. That's another way that you can compose. It's perfectly viable, and there's example. I will show you one example of each composer, very famous composer in each of these categories, so you get an idea that you can succeed with all of these tools, all these styles as well. You also have the third category, which I like to call the pure DAW, purely DAW, and then you orchestrate it separately. So these composers work the best if they just have a DAW and they just completely write everything in the DAW, no notation, nothing. What typically composers will do is that they'll write it in the DAW. Some of them might write out the parts in the DAW. Some of them might just go for block chords like me, and will typically kind of combine parts into like separate tracks. Again, the end like I said, no one's really gonna judge, in my opinion, how you particularly do it. The end result is kind of what matters. So anything you can do to improve your end result, I think it's fine. I said there's no like, when your players or when your watchers are playing your game or watching your film, right? They're not gonna be like, I think this composer didn't use individual parts. Unless they're really keen of ear maybe and can really spot that difference. Typically not really. So again, it's typically you have to know your audience, and so yeah, like I said, the pure DAW is a completely fine way to work. And typically if you want to use a live orchestra with this, two ways. One, if you do know how to notate, then typically if you do know how to notate, all you're going to do typically is that you're going to write out the part scores in your DAW and simply export it as a MIDI and then maybe put it in MuseScore or Sibelius or something and just re-notate it there. Another style that you can do, or another way you can do this, is you can hire an orchestrator. So you can give them your project file or like the MIDI track, give it to them, give them like the music as well, or give them the stems, and then they will orchestrate it for you into a proper, proper orchestration or proper score for an actual orchestra to play. So as I said, you can fall into any of these categories and you should just embrace your style. Like I said, each person has their own style, and I would recommend that you find that style before you move forward, because that will highly inform you on how you learn composition, how you execute composition, and the information afterwards that I provide afterwards, you'll know how to digest it in your own way. If you're asking about me, I will tell you what my style is at the very end. So let's look at some examples, shall we? So, pen and paper notation only. Of course, John Williams, the famous film composer, right? He reportedly writes with just pen and paper. He'll literally just sit down on his piano, he'll play something out, and he'll write it on pen and paper. John Williams is a very classically trained composer. He's a very classical style composer. Why do I say this? Because if you listen to a lot of his pieces, it has a lot of influence from classical music, and therefore I think his compositional style really reflects that. He's a pen and paper composer, similar to the inspirations that he has, right? You know, he has inspirations from Mahler, right? You can hear inspiration from Holst, from Tchaikovsky, from Stravinsky, right? More inspiration from Eric Korngold, right? So there's a lot of these classical composers that's really inspired by, and a lot of these classical composers didn't have computers, right? So they had to notate everything by hand. And so John Williams, I think, grew up in this kind of style and was brought up with the style of composing everything by hand. And like I said, very, very wildly successful. So don't feel that pen and paper will hold you back. No, John Williams is incredible. Like I said, writes Star Wars, right? Writes Jurassic Park, These amazing, amazing scores are just written just by pen and paper. So that's definitely a style that you can go to. I think it will require a little bit more classical training and a lot more very classical music theory, formal music theory training. Why? Because you're gonna have to know how to read notation, unfortunately, and you're gonna have to understand the basics of theory. In my opinion, it's a lot harder to just wing notation than it is in a DAW. So I think that's a little bit of the con there. But if you're up for the challenge, or you really like notation, like I said, you can achieve great success with it. For the DAW sketch / notated, after I've gone for John Powell. John Powell is the famous composer for the How to Train Your Dragon franchise, and you might hear his works in other movies such as Kung Fu Panda. I believe Call of the Wild was his latest one. Was one of his latest ones. I think he also did Solo, the Star Wars story. So he's basically, I guess, a spiritual successor to John Williams, and they have John as their first names, I guess. So connection is there, I guess. But interesting thing, John Powell does have a YouTube channel. I'll probably link it below this video. Check it out. He has he uploads frequently the DAW sketches that he writes, and it's absolutely beautiful and fascinating to listen to. What we know about his compositional style is that he would compose his sketch on a DAW first. He will write out these beautiful DAW sketches, like I said. Check out his YouTube channel, he has plenty of these. And then he will transfer these compositions into notation. So I'm not sure if he hires another engraver. I believe he orchestrates everything on his own, and he writes the notation on his own. I'm not sure if the final engraving is given to another person. Most likely given to another person, or like the final notation is created by another person, but I do know that he orchestrates everything by himself. That's that. How to Train Your Dragon, arguably, in my opinion, best soundtrack to a movie ever. Really beautiful leitmotifs, really strong emotions can be felt, in the entire soundtrack. Beautiful Isaac is one of the best use of leitmotifs ever, I think. You can get great success with this. Again, you still have to have that theory and knowledge. However, if you can write good part scores in your DAW sketch, like if you can do if you write in separate parts anyways, really easy to notate actually afterwards. So you can give this a try if you're not so theoretically strong, but you're not also too theoretically weak either. You can try the style maybe, and you can see what you come up with. Finally, we have the purely DAW composer, and It might come to shock to some people, might not, but Hans Zimmer does all of his composing on a DAW. It's funny. I believe if my information's not incorrect, I don't think he can even read notation, which is incredible for a composer of his, stature and his kind of reputation. To hear that he can't even read notation is impressive, honestly. And it just goes to show that you don't, your formal training can only get you so far. You still have to have the creativity. You still need to be smart about how you use that theory. So, just because you don't have that formal training, or you don't have, the money to afford music theory classes and everything, don't sweat it. You can still write great music. And like I said, even I fall into this third kind of line of work. I compose everything in a DAW these days. I started out as a pen and paper composer, and those works were complete and utter garbage, and I've since discarded them. I have samples of them just for my own reference, but it's more for a nostalgia trip rather than to actually listen to it or enjoy it. But yeah, so if you can only work in a DAW, you can't read notation at all. Don't sweat. You can completely be an amazing composer just being on a DAW. All right, so let's see the general workflow of these composing styles. And for those who have not even thought about their style or how they want to compose, I hope I can give you an idea of generally how the general workflow of each composing style goes, and therefore you can make a very informed decision about what style you think will suit you the best. So, pen paper notation only, this is how it typically goes. You have a piano sketch typically, because at least nowadays it's a bit easier with notation software. You can just kind of write it down and you can have this live feedback. However, back in the day when you only had pen and paper, and I believe a lot of pen and paper composers are like this simply because of the limitations of having zero software back in the day and having to do everything analog, you can't have this live feedback. So when you write stuff in paper, that note that you write down on paper can't magically play back. So typically a lot of these composers are really good pianists, and they'll just write a piano sketch, and as they're playing this sketch, they're composing, they're just writing their ideas down onto the paper and creating this full piano sketch. From this piano sketch, it becomes a little bit easier. You can transform this piano sketch into an orchestral sketch because the piano sketch already has your ideas, and like I said, you can play individual lines on a piano. The piano is the most versatile composing instrument in my opinion. The piano is absolutely necessary, I think. Knowing how the piano functions, at least, and being able to play very basic stuff on the piano, I think is important if you're a composer. You can still do completely fine without knowing how to play piano at all, but I think it's a great instrument to at least learn the very basics of in order to, so you can experiment with your compositions, right? So you take this piano score, and what you'll do is you'll orchestrate it. You start splitting it up into parts. So you split it up into the flutes, the woodwinds, the strings, right? The percussion, and you'll start writing out these parts. And then from these orchestral sketches, you will then refine it. You'll probably, I guess you can try to send these out to individual players. Nowadays, it's really easy. You can find players of any instrument on Fiverr or anything like that. Or you can just contact, if you have any friends in a conservatory, music conservatory, or doing any particular, or in an orchestra, you can probably just hand them out and just asking them to check your score to make sure it's playable, to make sure, there's no big issues. For example, you're not writing something for the French horn that's out of the French horn range, or you're you're writing something that's way too low for a violin to even physically play. So having just those people double check real quick, make sure it's fine, and then you would refine it into a finished score, and that finished score you would give it to the orchestra to record. And so that's how pen and paper notation software composers typically work. DAW sketching, kind of similar. However, you don't need a piano. Some people start with a piano sketch. You can if you want to. It's not compulsory. I don't really. So most composers like John Powell will start with a DAW sketch. They will sketch everything out in their DAW. Once that's done, then they'll have the notated sketch where they'll sketch everything. They'll just transfer this DAW sketch into notation, and from this notation sketch, like I said, it could still be very vague, or it could already be separated into part scores. Like I said, different composers, each their own, right, with this particular style. I believe John Powell writes all his parts already in the DAW, so honestly, really easy to transfer over. So you have the notated sketch, and again, send it to the individual players in order to double check and everything that you did it correctly. Or if you're really experienced, you probably know already what each instrument's capable of. Refine, and then you have your finished score. And that's the typical workflow of the DAW sketch notate after workflow. Lastly, the purely DAW, the one I personally do. So with DAW, you would write a sketch. Typically, I would write block chords, and I would generally have an idea of how I would figure out the chords or have a melody in mind, and I would just create these kind of block chords with strings or whatever in order just to get a sense of what chords I want to use under, and then I will orchestrate it later. Once you have this general sketch of the way the piece is going to sound, you then orchestrate it into individual parts. You start layering your instruments, because typically people who compose in the DAW, unless you're paying an orchestrator or you can orchestrate it yourself and hire a full orchestra, typically people in this category would, at least mostly these days, if you're on a tighter budget like me, you'll just use the instruments that you have, your virtual instruments, because real orchestras get real expensive real fast. And unless you are getting hired for a huge video game with a decent budget to hire an orchestra, notation typically isn't needed. So the finished score isn't even really. It's only for if you have the budget in order to record a live orchestra, in which case you'll probably send over your piece to an orchestrator, to an experienced orchestrator, or for them to take your sketch or your DAW orchestration into a proper score that can be playable to each player, and then you will record the orchestra. Or like I said, you stop at step 2 and you just use the VSTs. So that typically is the workflow for the purely DAW composer. Okay, last slide. Thank you for bearing with me for this video. Just get out what I would say right now is that now you should be pretty informed of what the different composing styles are out there, and hopefully this helps you to understand your composing style a little bit better. If not, if you don't know your composing style at all, I hope this gives you an information of what styles are out there, and hopefully what style you can use to fit your own compositions. Generally, for budding composers, here's what I would suggest. Personal suggestions to me, like I said, if you're very strong in theory and you have a very strong formal classical kind of training in theory, try using the pen and paper. You're going to get great results. Trust me. Pen and paper, pretty good way of doing it. If you're less musically, if you have less theory training, less notation training, you can't read notation, whatever, use a DAW. A DAW is easier to understand. You can visualize the notes better for someone who is not super strong in theory, and you basically don't have to read notation. So if you don't want to read notation, there it is. Just use the DAW. Although I think every musician should learn how to read a treble clef and a bass clef. That's key, I think. So, but you don't have to immediately know notation in order to start composing. That's the beauty of DAWs, right? Is that we remove this barrier of entry of needing to learn notation in order to start writing music. So armed with this knowledge, get out there, find your style, and get composing. And I'll hope to see you in the next video where we'll talk about a different subject. I haven't decided yet. Like I said, this is pretty impromptu, this series. I would like to share my thoughts. Like I said, I don't like to script these too heavily. So yeah, get out there and go to work. And I'll see you in the next one. Catch you there. Bye-bye.